So this year at BlizzCon, World of Warcraft had one of its best showings in the game's long history, with almost unanimously liked announcements, except for one thing. And the one negative piece of information we got with all of these World of Warcraft announcements is the inclusion of a 3-day early access for the War Within pre-order that's only on the Epic Edition, which is $90 USD and is the highest of the 3 editions. And I think my opinion on this may be a little bit different than a lot of other people's. And we do actually have some developers trying to explain their reasoning of adding in a 3-day early access into the game. Now, that was one of the 2 big changes to the pre-order editions. The other big change being that the level 70 boost that you would normally get with pre-orders from other expansions have been added to every tier. So the base edition, the heroic edition, and the epic edition all get the character boost. So one of the explanations from a lot of the developers was that they were adding that boost into all tiers to give them more value, but then they needed to add something else into the epic edition to give that more value. So they added 3-day early access. And I do want to be pretty clear with this, that every developer, including people like Ian Hazzikostas and any other developer that's been interviewed and asked about 3-day early access, none of those people that have talked about the game, talked about the early access, are people who actually made that decision. Ian Hazzikostas didn't say we're putting a 3-day early access into the pre-order. None of the people that are actually going to do interviews talking about the game made that decision. That was made from higher ups, probably at Activision, that just said you're adding a 3-day early access so we can try to get more sales of the Epic Edition. They send that to the Warcraft team, and then what probably happened is the Warcraft team tried to make the early access as fair as possible, since it's something that they don't have a choice to put into the $90 version of the game. And that does bring us to some really important information on what is actually going to be available in this 3-day early access, because there's actually going to be a lot of stuff you can't do. So certain endgame features, including mythic dungeons, weekly quests, will not be available during early access. Now, the developers did expand upon this. So basically anything that could potentially give you power will not be available to play through in this early access. So you won't be able to do mythic dungeons, you won't be able to be getting endgame gear through any systems in the game, any rares in the open world won't be dropping their endgame drops. So basically anything you could potentially do to get any endgame gear or progress won't be available in that 3-day early access. But one of the big things we don't know how it's going to play out is professions and gathering, because that could be a pretty big issue with not everybody being in the game in the early access, and specifically people being able to gather all of these resources before the game is actually released. Now, that could be a pretty big issue because that's a place where people make a lot of gold. In fact, a lot of people make a lot of their gold for the expansion in, say, the first couple weeks, but that first week, those first handful of days, usually resources sell for an extremely high amount that they probably shouldn't be selling for. So that could be a pretty massive issue with people having 3 days to just gather up resources. But again, we haven't actually had a confirmation on how that's going to work. We don't actually know if you're even going to be able to gather resources yet. Now, my general opinion on early access for video games, especially when it comes to MMOs, is I would rather not have them. Now, things like single player games, I don't really care. It doesn't make a difference at all. Starfield came with early access. It didn't really matter. That's a single player game. There's really no difference between having a 3 days early or 3 days later. Some games like Diablo 4, which also had early access, can kind of teeter, even though in Diablo 4 there wasn't any leaderboards or really any comparison or competition between gearing, so there's not a big issue with that either. But when it comes to MMOs is where it can be a pretty massive issue. And this isn't the first MMO that's done this. In fact, on the original launch of Guild Wars 2, you could actually get early access to that. I know Final Fantasy XIV has also had early access, even though that was in even their base version. And I do think that's actually one of the biggest issues with this, is that it's only in the highest version of the game. If there was a 3-day early access in every version, it kind of becomes meaningless. It's just another thing to kind of add in there. But as a general rule of thumb for MMOs, early access in higher pre-order editions, not not a good thing. Now, this does bring me to a much more personal opinion on this, and this is definitely a selfish opinion because I played the game since vanilla. I've gotten the highest tier version of most of the expansions, so whether there was a 3-day early access in or out of the game wouldn't negatively impact me, but as a very selfish opinion, I actually like the 3-day early access just for how I've traditionally played World of Warcraft, because with a 3-day early access and with all of these endgame features disabled, what this will allow me personally to do is go level up more characters without having to make sure I do all of the Mythic 0 dungeons and try to gear up those characters. Because starting an expansion, getting a character to max level, doing all your Mythic 0s, and partaking in all the other progression paths to get gear is one of the most enjoyable parts of a new expansion. You're getting new gear for every drop, you get to see all the new dungeons, your power is just increasing extremely quickly, so that's one of the funnest parts for me for a new expansion. But I also love leveling up alts and playing new alts, trying out different builds, and these two things are usually directly opposed to each other, because once you get a new character to max level, you have to go do all of your Mythic 0 and you have to go try to do all the other progression paths to get gear. But with a 3-day early access where you don't have to do any of that, I could just level up a bunch of characters to 70, then when Mythic 0 unlocks, I can go across all those characters and do that, and the time will be much more split up, allowing me to do a lot more of the things I actually want to do. So looking at this through the lens of game health, it's obviously not a good thing, should not be there. If it is in the pre-orders, it should at least be in every version. So any version of the game you pre-order should have that early access. Now, just as a small thing at the end here, if you're somebody that still very much wants to get the epic version to play the game 3 days early, which I know a lot of people are going to want to do, whether you like it or not, a lot of people are still going to get this. A lot of people that don't like it are still going to get the epic version because they want to play the game, because having one bad thing about the game isn't going to make you not want to play the rest of the game. And one thing you can very much do right now is just start farming gold. You could pretty easily buy the epic pre-order through WoW Gold by buying WoW tokens without a ton of extra playtime. There's actually a ton of really good ways to make gold right now, and because some of the changes that were recently made, there's some more protection against botters just buying more and more WoW tokens with gold. So that is also another option if you're somebody that still just wants to get the epic edition. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.